You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. After the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, Great Britain emerged as the dominant power over the land stretching from its colonies on the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. The Ohio River became a fragile boundary between the American colonies and the Native American communities of the Ohio country. To prevent conflict in this newly won territory from France, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which banned British settlers from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. Despite objections from settlers and investors both in Britain and the colonies, British officials managed to negotiate two treaties with Native Americans in 1768, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix and the Treaty of Hard Labor. These agreements opened up lands south of the Ohio River for settlement, which temporarily eased the tensions related to western expansion. However, as the American Revolution drew closer, the Ohio Valley became a hotspot of growing tension. The Grand Ohio Company focused on land speculation in native territories, and British land grants to war veterans as debt repayment stoked these tensions. A notable shift happened in 1772, when Britain redeployed its western forces to the east coast amidst rising confrontations with colonists, leaving the region open to illegal settlers. And in a turn of events, in 1774, Britain decided not to honor the land grants promised to colonial veterans, affecting significant speculators like George Washington. The same year saw the Quebec Act placing the Ohio River to Great Lakes region under Quebec's control. That spring, a settler group led by Daniel Greathouse committed a horrifying act known as the Yellow Creek Massacre, killing 13 native women and children. This brutal event, notably the killing of Tashnek Doris's wife and the gruesome murder of his pregnant sister Kune, triggered a vicious cycle of revenge supported by the Shawnee, who were upset about unpaid lands. Most Native Americans actually living in the Ohio Valley, such as the Shawnees, Mingos, Lenape, and Wyandots, weren't consulted in the 1768 treaties, leading to resentment towards the Iroquois for selling their lands. In response, Shawnees started organizing a confederacy to protect their territories. Despite efforts by the British and Iroquois to diplomatically isolate the Shawnees, the outbreak of Dunmore's War in 1774 saw them facing the Virginia militia with limited support. After Virginia emerged victorious, the Shawnees had to accept the Ohio River as the boundary. Nonetheless, leaders who disagreed with these terms revived their fight with the onset of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. From the beginning, the British forces and the leaders of the Continental Congress were eager to keep the Native American tribes in the western regions out of the conflict. A significant meeting occurred at Fort Pitt in October 1775, where American officials and Native American leaders agreed to respect the boundaries set by Dunmore's War the year prior. However, without support from the British, Native American chiefs like Chief Blackfish of the Shawnee and Pluggy of the Mingo began raids into Kentucky, aiming to push the settlers away. Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry, considered striking back by targeting Pluggy's town in the Ohio country. He eventually decided against it, worrying that the militia might end up attacking Native Americans who were neutral, confusing them with the hostile ones, potentially turning the peace-seeking Lenape and Shawnee tribes against them. Despite some leaders like White Eyes of the Lenape and Cornstalk of the Shawnee advocating for staying out of the conflict, others like Buckungahalas of the Lenape and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee chose to fight against the settlers. In Kentucky, the situation for settlers and hunters became dire as they faced regular attacks, forcing many to retreat back to the eastern states. By the late spring of 1776, the population in Kentucky had dwindled to fewer than 200 colonists, hunkering down in fortified places like Boonesboro, Harrodsburg, and Logan's Station for safety. The conflict in the area continued, and in December 1776, Pluggy met his end during an assault on McClellan's Station, which is now known as Georgetown, Kentucky. The Battle of Island Flats at Eaton's Station marked the beginning of the American War of Independence in the Western Territories. This skirmish took place in July 1776, right after America declared its independence from Britain. In this battle, American Patriot militia, backed up by a handful of regular soldiers, faced off against Cherokee warriors allied with the British. These warriors initiated a three-faced assault on settlers living in the over-mountain area of the Washington District. On July 20, 1776, their campaign began against the settlers situated in the lowlands opposite Long Island on the Holston River. Fortunately, the frontiersmen had been tipped off by messengers from the Cherokee diplomat Nancy Ward. The Cherokee forces, led by experienced chiefs Dragging Canoe, Tsiu Gansini, the Raven, Savanuka, and Oconostota, launched their assault. However, without the advantage of surprise on their side, the Cherokee quickly faced setbacks, suffering several casualties, and were forced to retreat. Among them, Dragging Canoe, who spearheaded the Eaton Station attack, was seriously injured but managed to survive. That same day, 2 other battles took place. Oconostota led a fight at Watauga and the Raven at Carter's Valley. Although the Raven managed to temporarily push out the inhabitants of Carter's Valley, his success was short-lived. Oconostota's group was similarly defeated and driven back. Back in 1777, the British kicked off the Saratoga campaign from Canada. To create a distraction for their operations in the Northeast, the British officials in Detroit started to gather and arm Native American groups to launch attacks on American settlements. These raids led to an unknown number of deaths among settlers in what are today Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The situation escalated after American militiamen, in a moment of fury, killed Cornstalk. He was a prominent Shawnee leader who had been pushing for his people to remain neutral. Despite the increasing violence, many Native Americans in Ohio still wanted to keep out of the conflict. That was easier said than done, considering their lands sat directly in the middle of the British forces in Detroit and the American settlers along the Ohio River. In the early days of the conflict, Virginians tried to protect their western frontier by stationing militiamen at 3 forts along the Ohio River, namely Fort Pitt, Fort Henry, and Fort Randolph. However, this strategy turned out to be ineffective, as Native Americans simply skirted around these forts during their raids. Realizing this in 1778, the Americans concluded that they needed to take the offensive to safeguard their western frontier. Then, in September 1778, the United States made a move to strengthen their position by negotiating the Treaty of Fort Pitt, through which they gained the support of the Lenape people for a planned attack on Detroit the next month. Unfortunately, the campaign had to be called off following the passing of the Lenape leader, White Eyes. The first attempt by Americans to enter the Ohio country did not go as planned. In the cold month of February, 1778, General Edward Hand took 500 Pennsylvania militiamen from Fort Pitt on a surprise march during winter. They aimed for the Mingo towns along the Cuyahoga River, targeting the British military supplies stored there, which were meant for Indian raiding parties. Unfortunately, bad weather stopped them from reaching their goal. On their way back, some of Hand's troops attacked neutral Lenape Indians, tragically killing a man, a few women, and children. Among the victims were relatives of the Lenape chief, Captain Pipe. Since the victims were all non-combatants, this unfortunate event earned the mocking title of the Squaw Campaign. Hand's troubles did not end there, as he also had to deal with loyalist sentiments in the Pittsburgh area. In March, 3 men with strong connections to the British and the American Indians left Pittsburgh to join the British and Indian side. They were Simon Girty, who had even guided the Squaw Campaign, Matthew Elliott, a local trader, and Alexander McKee, an agent for the British Indian Department. These 3 would later become key operatives for the British in the war. Amid heavy criticism and a congressional investigation into his failure to prevent these defections, Hand decided to resign in May. In 1777, as the war intensified, Americans living on the western frontier reached out to the Continental Congress, asking for protection. Following an inquiry, a congressional commission in early 1778 suggested placing 2 regiments from the Continental Army in the west. They also recommended building a fort on the Indian side of the Ohio River because a line of defensive forts had done little to stop Indian raids on American settlements. This fort would be the first of several, aimed at ultimately allowing the Americans to launch an attack on Detroit. Holidays, Cove Fort, erected in 1774 by soldiers from Fort Pitt, stood in present-day downtown Weirton, West Virginia, near Harmon's Creek, close to where it meets the Ohio River. Colonel Andrew Van Swearingen initially led the fort, followed by Captain Samuel Brady, a renowned leader of Brady's Rangers. In 1779, the fort housed over 28 militiamen. 2 years earlier, in an effort to relieve the besieged Fort Henry and Wheeling, Colonel Van Swearingen and a group of soldiers undertook a daring rescue operation by longboat down the Ohio River. This event is celebrated in a mural at the Cove Post Office by artist Charles Shepard Chapman, highlighting Colonel John Bilderback, who is also known for the tragic Gnadenhutten massacre of pacifist Indians in 1782. To establish a fort in the Ohio country, Americans needed the consent of the Lenape Indians. In September 1778, the Americans and the Lenape signed the Treaty of Fort Pitt, leading to the construction of Fort Laurens near the Tuscarawas River. Unfortunately, plans quickly unraveled. White Eyes, the Lenape leader who had helped broker the treaty, was reportedly killed by American militiamen later that year. His adversary, Captain Pipe, cut ties with the Americans and moved west to the Sandusky River, where he received backing from the British in Detroit. Additionally, due to heavy warfare in eastern Pennsylvania and upstate New York, Congress was stretched too thin to support any ventures against Detroit, leading to the abandonment of Fort Laurens in 1779. Back in the latter part of 1778, a young officer from the Virginia militia named George Rogers Clark undertook a bold mission to take control of the Illinois country, lightly guarded by the British, with a group of volunteer soldiers. On the 4th of July, Clark and his men swiftly took over Kaskaskia, the main hub in the Illinois country, and soon after, won over Vincennes. However, Vincennes didn't stay in their hands for long, as General Henry Hamilton, who was in charge at Detroit for the British, recaptured it. In a daring move, during February 1779, Clark led a surprise attack in the winter and managed to capture Hamilton himself. Hamilton was notoriously referred to as the hair-buyer general by American frontiersmen. The nickname came from their belief that he had encouraged Native Americans to attack and scalp American settlers. Because of these actions, Thomas Jefferson, who was governor at the time, had Hamilton brought to Williamsburg, Virginia, aiming to put him on trial as a war criminal. However, when British authorities threatened to harm American prisoners in retaliation, Jefferson decided to back down. In 1781, Hamilton was exchanged for an American prisoner. Despite Clark's tactical gains, capturing and holding strategic positions in the lower territories, the British continued to keep a strong foothold at Fort Lernout, which is modern-day Detroit. During the years of conflict, both sides engaged in various raids targeting each other's settlements. In the spring of 1780, British and Native American forces attempted to remove rebels and Spanish troops from the Midwest. They launched attacks on St. Louis, Cahokia, and parts of Kentucky. However, their efforts were thwarted in both St. Louis and Kentucky. In St. Louis, a force composed of British and Native Americans was driven back by defenders made up of Spanish and French Creoles, with Fort San Carlos playing a pivotal role in the city's defense. Unfortunately, during Byrd's expedition in Kentucky, many settlers were either killed or taken prisoner. In response, General George Rogers Clark took decisive action by crossing the Ohio River and leading attacks on Shawnee settlements along the Mad River, including Chillicothe and Piqua. Meanwhile, in the Illinois Territory, French officer Augustin de la Balme gathered local French militia in an ambitious attempt to capture Fort Detroit. However, this endeavor ended in tragedy in November, when Chief Little Turtle and his Miami warriors defeated La Balme's force. Around the same time, Americans from Cahokia managed to raid the nearly deserted Fort St. Joseph. But on their journey back, they were ambushed by British loyalists and Native Americans near Petit Fort. In St. Louis, Governor Francisco Cruzar of Spain decided it was time to take action. He sent out a group made up of roughly 140 Spanish soldiers and Native American warriors, all led by a captain named Eugenio Puré. Their mission was to take over Fort St. Joseph, and on February 12, 1781, they did just that, capturing and plundering the fort. Back in late 1780, an American named Clark made his way east to have a talk with Thomas Jefferson, who was the governor of Virginia at the time. They brainstormed an ambitious plan for the year 1781. Jefferson's idea was for Clark to head up a huge force of 2,000 men and take the city of Detroit. However, getting enough men to sign up turned out to be quite the challenge. In times of war, most fighters preferred to stick close to home instead of heading out on long missions. Adding to Clark's troubles, Colonel Daniel Brodhead wouldn't spare any of his men because he was planning his own attack against the Lenape, who had recently joined the fight against the Americans. In April, Brodhead's force pushed into the Ohio country and destroyed the Lenape's main town of Coshocton. This attack made the Lenape even more determined to fight back, and left Clark without the extra fighters and resources he desperately needed for his Detroit plan. Many of the Lenape people ended up moving to stronger positions along the Sandusky River. When Clark finally set off from Fort Pitt in August, he did so with a much smaller force of only 400 men. On August 24th, one of Clark's groups, consisting of 100 men, walked into an ambush near the Ohio River. They were attacked by Native Americans led by Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader who was also known as Thayendanegea, effectively putting an end to Clark's efforts to advance on Detroit. Around the same time, British and Native American forces launched an attack on Fort Laurens, a U.S. stronghold in the Ohio Territory. Caught in the middle of the conflict near the Sandusky River, and the Americans at Fort Pitt, were several peaceful Christian Lenape villages. These communities were guided by Moravian missionaries David Zeisberger and John Heckewelder. Despite being non-combatants and having a preference for the American cause, which they demonstrated by keeping American officials informed about British and Native American actions, they soon found themselves in a difficult situation. In September 1781, Wyandot and Lenape forces from Sandusky forcibly relocated these Christian Lenape, along with their missionaries, to a new settlement on the Sandusky River, which came to be known as Captive Town. In March of 1782, a group of 160 Pennsylvania militiamen, led by Lieutenant Colonel David Williamson, rode into the Ohio country. They were on a mission to confront Native American warriors who had been raiding settlements in Pennsylvania. Their anger was fueled by the brutal murder of a white woman and her baby by Native Americans. When Williamson's men came across about 100 Lenape, known as the Christian Munsi, in the village of Gnadenhutten, they detained them. These Christian Munsi had been at Gnadenhutten to harvest crops they left behind when they were forced to move. Accusing them of supporting the raids, the militia killed nearly all of them, mainly women and children, using hammers. Following this, Colonel William Crawford came out of retirement to lead a force of 480 volunteer militiamen, primarily from Pennsylvania, into Native American territory, aiming for a surprise attack. However, their plan was known in advance by the Native Americans and their British allies from Detroit, who countered them with about 440 fighters at Sandusky. After a day of fighting that didn't decisively favor any side, the Americans found themselves surrounded and tried to retreat, eventually turning into a disorderly flight. While most made it back to Pennsylvania, around 70 Americans were lost in the chaos. In contrast, the Native American and British side experienced minimal losses. During their retreat, Colonel Crawford and some of his men were captured. Many were executed as revenge for the Gnadenhutten massacre, with Crawford's death being particularly horrific, as he was tortured for over 2 hours before being burned at the stake. The failure of Crawford's expedition set off alarms across the American frontier, raising fears of renewed Native American raids. Indeed, 1782 brought more attacks, making it known as the Bloody Year for Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains. Notably, the Mingo leader Guyasuta led a significant raid into Pennsylvania in July, resulting in the destruction of Hannistown along with deaths and captures of settlers. Over in Kentucky, American forces were mostly on the defensive. In one incident, Colonel Benjamin Logan found out that Wyandot warriors, supported by the British in Detroit, were nearby. He sent a small team to reinforce Captain Estill, who ended up suffering a major defeat at what became known as the Battle of Little Mountain. In July 1782, a large gathering of more than 1,000 Native Americans at Wappatomica was called off due to incorrect intel about George Rogers Clark planning an invasion. Nonetheless, Caldwell led 300 warriors into Kentucky, inflicting heavy losses at the Battle of Blue Licks in August. One of the Revolutionary War's last battles was the September 1782 siege of Fort Henry. With peace talks progressing between the United States and Great Britain, further offensive operations were halted. Even though General Irvine had approval for an expedition into the Ohio country, it was cancelled. In November, George Rogers Clark struck the final American blow in the Ohio country by destroying several Shawnee towns, though the inhabitants suffered little harm. Historian David Curtis Skaggs, Jr. described the conflict in the Northwest as having ended in a stalemate. In the concluding years of this war, both sides were capable of destroying each other's settlements, but were unable to permanently occupy the territories they conquered. For the Shawnee people, the outcome was particularly dire, as the Americans not only managed to defend Kentucky, but also expanded their settlements, resulting in the loss of essential hunting grounds for the Shawnee. The American advancement pushed the Native Americans away from the Ohio River, settling them mainly around the Lake Erie Basin. Despite this pushback, the Americans couldn't move into the vacated lands due to the ongoing fear of Indian attacks. The news about the peace treaty being negotiated came in late 1782. In the final agreement, Canada had to cede parts of its Southwest Territory because the Ohio country and areas south of the Great Lakes were handed over to the United States by Great Britain, despite no American soldiers being present north of the Ohio River at the time of signing. It's important to note that Great Britain did not involve the Native Americans in the treaty discussions, and the treaty itself did not mention the Indians at all. The style of combat in the Western theatre was distinct from the European-style battles seen in the eastern part of the continent, leaving a lasting impact on both U.S. settlers and native nations. For native nations, the struggle to protect their lands didn't end with this treaty, but continued into the Northwest Indian War, albeit without British backing this time. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.